Have you noticed that there is a distinctive lack of new franchises and IPs lately? It seems like most of what we get these days are just the next Star Wars or Marvel show, most of which, if not all, have been, well, not particularly good. It's obvious that these are run by a board that operate on what their investors want and what their market research tells them. But this is no way to construct a story. Not one that's any good, anyway. Investors are not writers, and more often a blight than a benefit, and market research is decidedly less than reliable. Just look at how Star Wars isn't a guaranteed sell anymore. Now, I'm not going to get into the minutia of it, but the ones running the series now have made the worst possible choices. But all of this is exacerbated by a larger issue. Stories are not meant to go on endlessly. They're meant to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. An introduction, rising action, a climax, falling action, and a conclusion. These days, though, it's mostly just the same IPs being dragged out again and again, with Star Wars and Marvel being the most noticeable. And there are several problems that arise from this. Firstly, there's an issue in that it becomes more difficult to get into the series. If you have to engage with multiple pieces of media to understand it, the barrier for entry only becomes greater the longer that it goes on. Just look at superheroes. Many of them were created between the 1930s and 1960s or so. That's a lot of material to cover. Even if you were to look solely at the MCU, at the time of this recording, there are 33 movies in it. 33. It's certainly impressive, but also absurd at this point. While the MCU showed that it is possible to create an interwoven universe of films, it has spiraled out of control at this point. To watch and understand the newest movie, you would need to have seen at least most of the previous 33, and that's not even counting all the shows. That is, simply put, outrageous. Many of the events of these films could have been condensed and lowered the barrier, but it only becomes a larger hurdle with each passing installment. This means that you have to remember all of these characters, places, and events, and that list only grows and becomes more complex. This reminds me of machinery. The more moving parts you have, the more things that can go wrong. This is much the same. The more things that the audience has to keep track of, the greater the chance that they forget something. Now, this isn't to say that the audience is stupid, or only makes simple stories. Far from it. Many great stories are complex, but they know when to let it end, rather than drag it out for installment after installment. This also raises the issue of what to do with the stakes of the plot. In the MCU, Thanos was the ultimate antagonist. He was the big bad, and achieved his goal of annihilating half of all life in the universe. But what do you do after that? Well, largely speaking, you have three options. The first one, and the one that should have happened, is to end the story. It had its beginning, its rising action, its climax, falling action, and conclusion. It had run its course. The second option is to continue to raise the stakes in the next cycle. This has its own problems. There had already been an exorbitant number of films leading up to Infinity War and Endgame, and doing another cycle only adds to that pile. The human mind can only comprehend so much though. When someone tells you to imagine 1,000 people, most people are just going to picture a crowd. They aren't going to imagine all the intricate details of each person's life. This means that when the stakes are raised to something on a universal scale, it loses a bit of its meaning and impact. The scale is just more than what your mind or any other can truly comprehend. It's like if someone asks you to imagine the distance between Earth and the edge of our solar system. Oh, you know that it's an enormous distance, But your brain doesn't have any concept of that scale. It's farther than the scope of what our brains are designed to deal with. Now imagine that that's only the tiniest fraction of the scale. It's too much. And with things like multiverses coming into play, that only makes the problem worse. I'm always apprehensive of multiverses. Oftentimes, it's just a cheap way of creating scenarios that would never exist normally, or to bring back a character from the dead who will somehow behave exactly like their deceased counterpart, even when they wouldn't have the connections and experiences to do so. The third option is to create small-scale stories focused on individual characters or events. This is the general approach that the MCU has taken, but given the lack of good writing, it would have been better to simply end the story. Simply dragging things on makes each event lose impact and context. So your characters defeated the big bad, but then there's just going to be one after that, and then one after that, and then one after that. Do you see how this makes them all lose importance? Star Wars is in much the same boat. Just look at how much of a mistake the sequel trilogy was. It didn't even have a clear outline from the beginning. They just made it up as they went, with each director undermining the other. All it was a cash grab. Nothing more. And then we have the issue of all the remakes, reimaginings, reboots, rebranding, all of it. Disney has been cranking out live action, or similar to it, remakes of their old classics, but those have been lesser than the originals at best, and completely atrocious at worst. We need new stories to stand alongside the old. Those that came before shouldn't be forgotten, but they shouldn't be dragged out and paraded around for cheap sales. They deserve to be respected and allowed to end. This is why I support things like YouTubers and small groups making their own stories. They can be far more creative than just another installment of a big budget franchise run by bigwigs chasing after whatever they think will get them the most money. That's how we win. By making our own stories and supporting those with good original ideas, not the daft juggernauts looking to make money from key-jangling nostalgia. I have to wonder how many great stories we'll never see because they were turned down by publishers or higher-ups in Hollywood for not matching with their market research. It saddens me to think about it. Market research can't factor in imagination and creativity. Just look at some of the great films from decades past. Things like Terminator, Predator, Aliens, Indiana Jones, Jaws, and more all came from something unique that would never be made today because those in control wouldn't see them as a guaranteed sell. So if you find someone making something you like, in whatever medium it is, support them. I'll take something original with passion behind it any day over the next flaccid corporate-driven drivel, and you should too. But I would like to thank you for watching. What are your thoughts on this? When is enough for a series? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and leave a like on this video if you're so inclined, and subscribe to see more. And may you all have a weapon in each hand.